is very, very clever. And although the picture was acquired by the Turkish ambassador to Paris, who loved spicy subject matter, to Ingres it was anything but that. He has preferred to present the truth as he himself saw it, as a grave and dreamy preparation for the most serious of activities.
Next Monday, The Sleeping Gypsy by Rousseau, one of the most memorable fantasy images ever painted, Monday at 7:30 here on 2. In 45 minutes, we join Tracy MacLeod for The Late Show. But first, here's Tuesday's Newsnight.
Good evening. Edwina Currie changes her mind. She will appear tomorrow before the MPs inquiring into the eggs and salmonella row. But when Mrs Currie meets the Agriculture Select Committee, she says she won't have anything new to tell them. And indeed, she casts some doubt on the committee's right to demand that she give evidence. I'll be discussing the constitutional implications of tomorrow's encounter with John Biffen, the former leader of the Commons. Also tonight, another leading political figure in Japan is forced to resign over the recruit shares scandal. We look at the background to the affair which has ruined so many reputations. The Transport Secretary announces a new offensive against drunken and dangerous drivers and says he wants to cut road casualties by a third. And in France, the Empire strikes back. But can this new epic on the revolution revive the fortunes of the French film industry? We report from Paris on today's £20 million government package to combat the competition from Hollywood. And Catherine Deneuve tells us how she would get audiences back into the cinemas for French films. We begin with Edwina Currie's change of mind about appearing before the Commons Committee on Agriculture. She will meet the MPs tomorrow to answer questions on her role in the salmonella in eggs affair. But in the letter she sent this evening to the chairman of the Select Committee, the Conservative MP Jerry Wigan, Mrs Currie says that she will appear only out of personal courtesy to him, and she makes it clear she objects to the way in which she has been summoned. Earlier, in a specially convened session, the committee voted by 9 votes to 1 to insist that she should attend tomorrow's full meeting, which will also question the Agriculture Minister, John McGregor, and the Health Secretary, Kenneth Clarke. The committee's vote today was as much to do with the powers of MPs as it was to do with eggs. But the question now facing the committee and the government is, will Mrs Currie actually say anything, and if she doesn't, what then? Our political editor, John Cole, has been following this continuing controversy.
This used to be Parliament's ultimate deterrent. The clock tower contained the Commons prison, where those who fell foul of parliamentary privilege were incarcerated, though usually only for a short time. Charles Bradlaugh, the essayist MP, spent a night there in 1880 when he refused to take the oath of allegiance, but he was later allowed to affirm. And in 1846, Smith O'Brien had his collar felt by the Sergeant-at-Arms because he declined to sit on the English Railway Committee. Edwina Currie, who first came to prominence when she flourished handcuffs during a law and order debate at the Tory party conference, was in no real danger of feeling the gyves on her own wrists. But the whole issue of her refusal to give evidence to the committee had ignited again because of weekend reports that she was going to write a book to be serialised in the Sunday Times. The committee met this afternoon in special session. The Conservatives have a majority on the 11-member committee. In today's voting on whether to force her to attend, the chairman took no part, but 4 other Tories sided with the opposition, leaving a single vote for Mrs Currie. A letter immediately went to her. Either she promised quickly to attend tomorrow, otherwise the committee would report her to the House.
Well, I think they felt that there was confusion reigning. The public were confused and they wanted to be seen to be definitive. They had resolved that they did want to hear from Mrs Currie, and so they passed the resolution by a vote of 9 to 1.
The sole dissenter still doubted the value of calling her.
There's no certainty that she's going to give us any firm evidence at all. I mean, the Select Committee can summon people and papers, that's its prerogative, and I quite understand those who feel that we ought to preserve that constitutional right. But of course, once they get in front of the committee, nothing can compel them actually to give us substantial information. There have been experiences in the past where that has been the case.
I always believed that she had a ministerial future because I believe that she is an extremely able woman and a woman of unusual talents. But I believe that her action recently has made the likelihood of a return to the front bench to be diminishing as time goes by.
Mrs. Currie's reply to the committee came 2 hours later. She made the constitutional argument saying the rights and immunities of individual members were established long before the rights and powers of select committees to compel certain witnesses. But then came her highly personal olive branch to the committee chairman. But you, Jerry, are like me a former minister, and I hope a friend. To spare you further embarrassment, and as a personal courtesy, I will come to your meeting. One of her sternest critics wasn't wholly impressed.
I don't much care for the tone of Mrs. Currie's reply to us, but I am delighted that common sense has won the day and that she has accepted our invitation to appear before us.
When she does come before the committee tomorrow, it's her role in the salmonella affair which will be under scrutiny.
But what we really want to know was on what basis Mrs. Currie made her original statement in December. Was it as a result of briefing by her department officials, or was it in fact just off the top of her head?
A constitutional expert has other priorities.
Principle is absolutely crucial because the select committees exist to inform Parliament, to get at the heart of what has been going on in ministries and in government circles. And when there are MPs who have a particular connection or a particular expertise, then I believe it is the duty of such an MP to give the information to the Select Committee, and it is the duty of the Select Committee to see that that information is made available.
Despite all the comings and goings, this was never exactly a grave constitutional crisis. But the row surrounding Edwina Currie showed disturbing signs of becoming less about eggs and more about egos. So Conservative colleagues are relieved she's climbed down. But whether this will be enough to salvage hopes of eventual return to ministerial office is quite another matter.
That was John Cole reporting. Well, John Biffen, as a former leader of the House, after all this brouhaha, tomorrow's meeting of the committee is going to be a very extraordinary one. Will it still be worthwhile?
Oh yes, and I think the point that has been established is very worthwhile, namely that if a select committee in its investigations feels that it can be aided by evidence from a Member of Parliament, and particularly from a Member of Parliament who has just left office, which covers the controversy under question, then that member should attend and should give evidence, and that principle will be confirmed by tomorrow's meeting.
Do you also, perhaps, like Mrs. Winterton, object to the tone of Mrs. Currie's eventual acceptance? Her saying, for example, that she's only going along as a personal courtesy to Jerry Wigan.
I'm much happier that Mrs. Currie has now agreed to go before the committee and give evidence. Then I wish to start being a textual critic about the nature of the letter that she presented. But I'd like to say this. Every member of the House of Commons who is concerned about the prestige of the House of Commons, who is concerned about the effective workings of the select committees, will be reading that letter and making their own judgments.
Would you, when you were a minister, have been perfectly pleased to go along to select committees and not just give evidence, but give full evidence? Oh,
but there is a distinction between a minister giving evidence and a member of Parliament, and I think this is really why the difficulties have arisen. Select committees, the departmental select committees, were established in 1979 under the broad guidance of Norman St. John Sievers, who was referred to earlier in this programme. And that laid out fairly clear rules and conventions which would govern ministers appearing before select committees. What is unusual is for the select committee to ask one of its fellow members to appear. It's happened in the past, and what really led to it happening now was that the Member of Parliament had only recently been a minister, and that the area under discussion and under examination related to the time when she was a minister.
But you heard Mr. David Currie, no relation, of course, of Edwina Currie's, saying just a few moments ago that there is no compulsion on Mrs. Currie to give any substantial information tomorrow at all.
That's perfectly true. And in the days when I served in the ranks in the army, there was a line of behaviour known as dumb insolence. And that, of course, is available to anyone giving evidence to a select committee, but I strongly recommend it is not followed for this reason. If the select committee feels that a witness is not cooperating, it has the opportunity to report that fact back to the House of Commons, and for the House of Commons then to decide what is an appropriate course of action. And I cannot believe that Mrs. Currie would wish to attend the committee and then try and frustrate their intention, which is to try and establish all the information they can to enable them to report to the House of Commons about the circumstances of the salmonella dispute.
So on Mrs. Currie's demeanour at the meeting of the committee tomorrow, do you think depends her chances, described by Mrs. Winterton now as diminishing, her chances of returning to government office?
Well, I think there will be a welcome that Mrs. Currie is now prepared to give evidence to the committee, and I think that any future judgment will turn upon the way in which she gives that evidence. I don't want to prejudge that circumstance, but of course I think that Mrs. Winterton is quite right in saying the House of Commons respects those members who, broadly speaking, observe the conventions of the House of Commons, and those who think that they're above those conventions, on the whole and in the longer run, pay for it.
John Biffen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The leader of one of Japan's main opposition parties stepped down today, the latest victim in a share trading scandal which has rocked the country's political and business communities. The Recruit affair has gripped Japan, in fact, since last summer. It has already led to the downfall of 3 senior cabinet ministers and now threatens to engulf the government of Prime Minister Takeshita. The politicians implicated in this scandal are accused of accepting thousands of pounds in cash and cheap shares from the Recruit group of companies, whose interests range from skyscrapers to supercomputers. Now, there have always been allegations of widespread corruption within Japan's main political parties. But as Chris Lowe in London reports, the extent of this latest scandal has led to a public clamour for wholesale reform.
The leader of one of the main opposition parties is the latest in a long line of Japanese political casualties. Why? Because the stench of bribery and corruption has permeated politics there for years, and the latest scandal is claiming new victims with unseemly regularity. The first to fall was the Japanese equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister Miyazawa. At the end of last year, the Justice Minister went, just 3 days after being appointed to try to clean up the mess. Top businessmen have fallen from grace, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Takeshita, has not yet managed to convince the world that Japanese politics have been cleansed. That's partly because he too is implicated in a scandal which centres on the activities of a business information and property group called Recruit Cosmos. Shares in the business were sold for a nominal sum to many of Japan's top people just before the company went public in 1986. And as a result, the fortunate few managed to make profits on the stock exchange, sometimes running into hundreds of thousands of pounds each. One of the Prime Minister's assistants and one of his relatives are among the beneficiaries. So too are close friends of Mr. Yasuhiro Nakasone, who was Prime Minister at the time Recruit's chairman, Hiromasa Ezo, floated the company.
My guess is maybe Mr. Nakasone is the main target of the investigation by prosecutors. There is a rumor, but rather I'd like to say he's morally and politically very responsible, because when Mr. Ezo was appointed by the Prime Minister Nakasone to many important roles of governmental advisory groups, these kind of scandals started.
There was nothing illegal about making such huge profits on the cheap, provided there was no suggestion that the company wanted something from the politicians in return. But there was.
This is a new principle in Japanese politics. In fact, I think it's a new principle in politics of the world. It's another Japanese technological first. Now, it opens up two fascinating possibilities. If it's legal, it means that the Japanese politicians can put the bite on companies for their shares, not just money. The companies have to give shares to the politicians, which adds a new hazard to being in business in Japan. That's if it's legal. But if it's illegal, then most of the present cabinet, and in fact most of the members of parliament, belong in jail because they've all been collecting shares from Recruit, and one suspects maybe from other companies too.
It reminds all Japan of the downfall of Prime Minister Tanaka in the mid-70s, because he'd accepted a $2 million bribe from the American Lockheed Aircraft Company. Bribery and corruption may not be endemic in Japanese public life, but the political system, in which party fundraising events play a key part, does nothing to discourage it. Politicians need wealth to stay in power, because the electoral system is so competitive that voters are showered with gifts at election time.
It's not only very competitive, but also very, very costly, because Japan has a middle-sized constituency system, which means that from each constituency, there are as many as 4 or 5 representatives are elected. So on the part of one single candidate, he would have to appeal to this huge mass of voters, very often close to 1 million in one constituency.
If you remember what the police chief said, you just don't expect politicians to be honest. You don't buy fish at the grocery store. Not in that sense, because you must remember that all of those politicians who in general are thought to be rather bent, personally are very nice chaps as far as the individual voter is concerned. I mean, eat and swill lasted a long time because people like to eat and swill. And the voters like the attention they get from the politicians. They like that 10,000 yen note, that's about nearly 50 pounds, thrust into their hands when their daughter's getting married or when they open a new business or when somebody's ill. They like the attentions of Lord Bountiful.
All of which is fine until the people start to think it's they who are being taken for a ride, that all those free gifts are being paid for by higher land prices, for example. And once suspicion is aroused that those who give money to the politicians expect favours in return, then even the tolerant Japanese demand the most thoroughgoing investigation, which could just herald the end of one-party rule in Tokyo.
Japanese people are really frustrated, and it's just because our political situation is really I should say, political corruption, like the England before 1832 reform. And in the coming years, maybe there will be a big political reform. Because of this Recruit affair, in the long run, there will be a political realignment. I mean that so-called one-party dominance by the conservative LDP will come to an end.
Corruption or wrongdoings of this magnitude have been surfacing only the past 2-3 decades. And I would mainly attribute to this national thinking that the economic success should come before anything else. And this goes to the question of the fundamental national sense of values, which has been characterized by this single-minded pursuit of economic success and nothing else.
As we would say, money talks.
Money talks.
That something is rotten in Japanese politics, no one disputes. What's new is that the people seem unwilling to tolerate it anymore. The government's popularity is lower than ever, and Prime Minister Takeshita has promised firm action to clean up his country's political system. Some say he means it. Others point out that he's up for re-election in October and is merely turning the scandal to his own advantage. The truth may be this. Most post-war Japanese prime ministers have been investigated for corruption. It's a statistic the people now find increasingly embarrassing.
Chris Lowe reporting. And now some of the other main news stories of the day. The government is to introduce tough new penalties against dangerous and drunken drivers as part of a sweeping new review of the country's road traffic laws. The Transport Secretary, Paul Channon, told MPs today that he intends that road casualties should be cut by 1/3 before the end of the century. Christopher Wayne now reports.
Britain has the best road safety record in Europe. But even so, about 5,000 people die on the roads every year, and another 300,000 are injured. 1/5 of the deaths involved drinking drivers. But until now, they could often be convicted only of relatively minor offences. Sometimes juries never knew there'd been a fatal accident. All that will change. Drink drivers whose victims die face a new offence of causing death, with up to 5 years imprisonment. Vandals who drop heavy objects from road bridges or interfere with road signs will now face a possible 7-year jail sentence. The government say the new penalties are tough, but justified.
There are all sorts of things that we see all the time where people really do deserve to be hammered. They're quite different from the average run of motorists, the overwhelming majority of motorists who drive perfectly sensibly and occasionally make a small mistake. Those are not the people this is intended for at all.
The courts will be reserved for more serious offenders. Others will get a ticking off on the spot.
There'll be no further action on this occasion. All we ask of you is to be safe. Okay. Thanks a lot.
And police manpower be used more economically by introducing new technology, such as fixed cameras of the type successfully tested at traffic lights in Nottinghamshire. These work automatically when anyone jumps a red light. And video cameras carried by unmarked police cars can now provide evidence of dangerous driving.
4 teenagers have been sentenced to periods of youth custody after a clash between rival football fans was secretly filmed by police. The fighting between supporters of Manchester United and Manchester City took place outside Old Trafford during a friendly match last May. 2 senior doctors at the centre of the Kidneys for Sale controversy, Dr. Raymond Crockett and Mr. Michael Buick, have tonight been banned from using the facilities of the private Humana Wellington Hospital, pending inquiries both by the Department of Health and the General Medical Council. Earlier, the government confirmed it is working urgently on a draft bill outlawing the sale of transplant organs. Iran's Foreign Minister, Dr. Ali Akbar Velayati, made a surprise visit to the Foreign Office tonight, where he had an hour-long meeting with Sir Geoffrey Howe. The hostage issue was not specifically discussed, but Dr. Velayati said afterwards every effort should be made to release all hostages, regardless of nationality. A hard-hitting report issued by the US State Department has accused the Israelis of a substantial increase in human rights violations in the occupied territories. The report, an annual survey of human rights worldwide, says the abuses date from the start of the Palestinian uprising 14 months ago. Meanwhile, the State Department spokesman Charles Redman has said that last Saturday's alleged attempt to infiltrate northern Israel by radical Palestinian guerrillas could have a negative impact on US-PLO dialogue. The US ambassador in Tunis will meet the PLO shortly to discuss that incident. And in the United States, Senator John Tower's prospects of becoming the new administration's defense secretary improved tonight after an FBI investigation reportedly cleared him of allegations about his private life. There has been uncertainty over his appointment after a Senate committee asked for further checks on Mr. Tower at the end of last week. It would take 9 years and cost up to £1 billion to carry out a full recovery operation on the sunken remains of the Piper Alpha oil platform, according to an expert commissioned by the owners, Occidental. 30 bodies are still missing, but relatives attending the public inquiry heard today that it would be too risky to